On a winter night, in those hours when the sky had turned a deep shade of navy blue, the blanket of snow covering the village had buried everything in a thick, white silence. After a long night that seemed to have no end, when a faint, uncertain light began to appear on the horizon, the village was still in a deep sleep. Only the muffled howl of the distant wind, and from time to time the soft sound of snow sliding from the rooftops, could be heard. This village was a small and forgotten place in the north of Russia, a point that did not appear on maps, surrounded by pine forests, silently witnessing long winters and heavy lives. In this village, inside a tiny wooden house, a man named Ivan was sleeping. On his back he carried the weight of years, in his hands the hardness of soil, and on his face both fatigue and a strange kind of resignation. In the stove, the embers left by a few logs that had barely burned through the night were still glowing faintly red. In this room, where the smell of smoke and soot mingled, the air was neither truly warm nor truly cold. But even that was a luxury for Ivan. He kept his eyes closed for a while longer and listened to the silence. No human sound came from outside, no clatter of hooves, no creak of wheels, only the heavy breath of winter. Slowly he opened his eyes. For a while he stared at the darkened wooden beams of the ceiling. Those beams had seen many winters, many harsh years, many forgotten lives, yet had remembered none of them. Every winter began anew. Every person carried their burden all over again. Ivan pulled the thick but worn wool blanket off of himself. The cold air touched his skin at once, and a fine shiver ran through his body. As he pulled on his wool socks, he glanced at the patched heels. Even the thought of buying a new pair someday was a luxury, because for people like them, anything new meant either more debt or more work. He walked slowly over to the stove. He opened the iron door. The embers inside seemed to be taking their last breath. He carefully placed a few pieces of wood, wedging some dry twigs between them. In harsh winters, wood was as precious as bread. Even going into the forest to gather it was risky. The landowner's men would never leave unpunished anyone who cut branches from the Lord's forest without permission, but the cold, too, dealt its own punishment. So the peasant lived on a thin line between two kinds of penalties. As Ivan arranged the wood, he muttered to himself, "Slowly, burn slowly, get us through today as well." He had no matches, of course. With small flint stones and some dry grass, he patiently coaxed the fire back to life. As the sparks turned into tiny orange points and grew, the room slowly began to warm up. On the small table lay a piece of stale black bread left from the day before, and a little cabbage. Ivan took the bread in his hand. It had gone hard, the edges like stone. But for winter, this was still considered good. He thought about the previous winter. After a dry summer, the harvest had been poor, yet the taxmen of the landowner had demanded the same amount as always. The share of the Tsar, the Lord, and the Church, they said. Almost nothing had been left to the peasant. That winter, a few old people and a few children had quietly left this world in the village. There were no grand funerals, no people with strength left to cry. Only snow, silence, and slow acceptance. As if wanting to push that memory quickly out of his mind, Ivan began to gnaw at the bread. He ate each bite calmly, without haste. Hunger was no longer a sharp feeling for him, but a constant part of life. When a person is hungry all the time, after a while the mind stops fighting that hunger and accepts it as a steady humming noise in the background. He filled the iron kettle he had set by the stove with water. The water had been carried in from the outside well and brought in the night before. It was cold but drinkable. He tossed in a few dried herbs and some withered leaves. This was tea for them, brown, slightly bitter, but hot. And anything hot in the middle of winter was a small blessing. After a while the water began to boil. It was a sound Ivan had known since his childhood. The boiling merging with the crackle of the stove always brought him a bit of peace, even on the hardest days. As he put on his thick fur coat, he felt the weight on his shoulders go beyond the physical. It was not just the weight of cloth and leather, it was also the weight of debts, forced labor, and the unfree life of a peasant. He took a deep breath as he stepped outside and opened the door. The village looked as if it had disappeared in the middle of a white sea. Thick layers of snow on the roofs, thin trails of smoke rising from the chimneys. The distant forest appeared like a gray wall. When Ivan stepped out, that familiar sound of snow underfoot, a light crunch, filled his ears. It felt as if his feet were not touching the ground but stepping on a soft pillow. The air was sharply cold, but the wind for now was gentle. For winter, this was a small mercy. His first task was to tend to the animals. He walked toward the barn. When he opened the door, a wave of warm breath mixed with cold air spread outward. A cow, a horse, and a few chickens. Their lives were just as hard as those of the people. Winter was a trial for the animals, too. Enough hay, enough straw, enough shelter. Everything depended on the question, is there enough? Ivan stroked the cows' heads, smoothed the horses' mane. He gave them a few handfuls of feed. Even though he himself often ate less than they did, he could not change that order, because if the animals died, there would be no sowing in spring, no crops carried, and the peasant's life would collapse completely. As he stepped out of the barn, he saw his neighbor Pavel in the distance. A bundle of firewood was slung over his shoulder, and on his face was a weary yet accustomed expression. "Good morning, Ivan," Pavel called, the steam from his breath drawing little white clouds in the air. Ivan nodded in greeting. "Good morning." Pavel came closer, dropped the wood from his shoulder, and stretched his back with a slight groan. "The landowner's men came again yesterday," he said quietly. "They say the tax won't be reduced this year either. In fact, it may even increase." Ivan was not surprised. It was exactly the kind of sentence he had expected. Every winter the same words went around the village. Every year they said, "This year will be a bit harder." And every year it really did get a bit harder. "It's only the beginning of the year," Ivan said, with a calm voice and a soft sigh. "I don't know how much we can gather before we even see the spring." Pavel adjusted the garment on his shoulders. "The land isn't ours. The crop isn't ours. Only the winter is ours. And that's more than enough," he said, with a bitter smile. Ivan smiled faintly too. Sometimes such lines were spoken just to lighten the heaviness of reality. They stood in silence for a while. Then Pavel said his goodbyes and started walking back toward his house. Ivan, on the other hand, turned his steps toward the narrow path that led into the forest. The road to the forest began with a slight incline out of the village. He remembered the first time he had walked this road as a child. His father had held his hand and said, "These trees are our secret friends that keep us standing through the winters." But as he grew older, he had understood that even the trees weren't really theirs. In the eyes of the Lord's men, every branch, every shadow, every trunk in the forest belonged to the landowner. As the path narrowed, the snow grew deeper, and the thick trunks of the trees hid more and more of the sky. Even the sound of the wind changed inside the forest. The straight, long howl heard in the village turned here into a whisper that wandered between the trees, touched the branches, and played with the shadows. Here and there were stumps of trees that had been cut before. These were the traces of the peasant's silent struggle. Perhaps a tree had been cut a bit too much, perhaps a little too greedily burned. But no one spoke of such things aloud. In the forest, Ivan began to gather fallen dry branches that no one claimed. He had brought his axe as well to cut proper logs, but he knew he had to be careful. Sometimes the Lord's forester roamed quietly and would catch anyone cutting wood without permission, punishing them severely. Sometimes with money, sometimes with a beating, sometimes with days of forced labor. With every branch he picked up, with every breath he took, Ivan weighed again what was risk and what was necessity. In winter, even the way a person looked at a simple piece of wood changed. Hours passed. The sun became just a faint smudge behind gray clouds. The weather cleared a little, but the cold did not lessen. Ivan tied the bundle of wood onto his back with cords. The weight on his shoulders pressed down on his body and his thoughts alike. But this tiredness was like an old companion to him. Every day he carried the same weight, every day he took the same steps. On his way back to the village, he heard the sound of a wagon. In the distance, a horse-drawn cart was slowly making its way across the snow. On it sat a broad-shouldered man in a thick fur coat with long mustaches, clearly one of the landowner's guards. At the back of the cart were large sacks, a few crates, and several covered chests. Ivan stepped aside to let the cart pass. The guard looked him over with a gaze that was half indifferent, half arrogant. To men like him, peasants were nothing but numbers. How many households, how many tax debts, how many men could be sent to war? When the cart had gone, Ivan drew in a deep breath. Sometimes he heard that behind those carts, peasant boys and young men were taken away as conscripts. War might seem far away, but conscription was a fate that could knock on their door at any moment. Most of those who left the village never came back. Those who did returned with distant eyes that seemed unable to recognize even the same village. By the time he reached the village, it was nearing midday. In front of a few houses, women and children were busy with this or that. In front of one house, an old woman was trying to wash laundry, plunging her hands into ice-cold water and pulling them out quickly, breathing fast. Life was heavy everywhere, but it went on. Ivan stacked the wood by the side of his house. He counted silently to himself, estimating by eye. Will this last for a week of fire? He couldn't give himself a clear answer. Such questions depended sometimes on the direction of the wind, sometimes on an unexpected guest, sometimes on a sudden bout of illness. When he stepped inside, the stove was still burning. Black soot stains had spread all the way into the corners of the walls. Even so, this tiny space was a refuge compared to the freezing world outside. He prepared a simple soup for midday, some cabbage, a few potatoes, and a couple of bones left from the day before. As the water in the pot boiled, a simple yet warm smell spread through the room. The small riches hidden in poverty were often found in such smells. While drinking his soup, he looked at the small icon on the wall. The faces of Mary and Jesus were faded, darkened by smoke and time. Yet they were still there. When their own strength was not enough, people liked to fix their eyes on a point and whisper something from within. Perhaps those whispers reached God, perhaps the earth, or perhaps only their own hearts. We've seen worse days, Ivan thought. In some winters, no smoke would rise from certain chimneys in the morning. Everyone would understand that life inside had gone out. So far, this winter had not brought such silent news. Even that was a kind of comfort. In the afternoon, he had to go to the village square for the forced labor demanded by the landowner's men. Each peasant, on certain days of the year, had to work on the Lord's land as well, as if his own work were not already enough. This angaria, compulsory labor, was one of the most unchanging facts of their lives. Ivan put on his thick clothing again, took his shovel in hand, and blended into the group of peasants in the square. The faces were familiar. Pavel, there with his thin frame but stubborn eyes. Nikolai, whose face carried the marks of many years. Young Alexa, whose back was already beginning to curve. Little Misha, whose face still held a childlike curiosity. The landowner's steward was a short man with a hard face. He spoke in a loud voice. You must clear the road to our Lord's granary. The snow has made it impassable. The supply wagons will arrive tomorrow. All of you will go there. No one objected. Everyone knew what objection would bring. Punishment sometimes meant extra taxes, sometimes sticks, sometimes days and days of endless work. Ivan and the others began to walk toward the road leading to the Lord's manor. Once they left the village, the landscape changed. Large, stone-walled, more orderly buildings made it clear they had entered the Lord's world. Even the snow piled on the manor's roof seemed more dignified, more neatly arranged. The peasants started clearing the road with their shovels. The snow was piled high to the sides, and a hard, icy ground emerged beneath. Each thrust of the shovel left a heaviness in their arms and a sting in their backs. But this kind of fatigue was too ordinary to discuss. At one point, while pausing to catch his breath, Ivan glanced at the manor windows. A soft light seeped through them. Perhaps inside people were walking on thick carpets. Perhaps the smell of hot soup, fresh bread, meat, and wine was drifting through the rooms. Perhaps this harsh winter outside was nothing more than a beautiful view from within. That thought created a faint ache in his chest. But there was an unspoken rule. Such an ache was never voiced aloud, because in these lands, the phrase, "It has always been like this, and it will always be like this," was a truth as old and thick as the snow. Hours passed. Their arms grew heavy. The insides of their gloves grew damp with sweat. Their breath rose as steam into the air. But at last, the road was cleared. The Lord's man showed his satisfaction with the slightest nod. "Good work," he said, whatever good meant. Good for whom? For whom was it nothing more than the same old routine? Towards sunset, the peasants began to make their way back to the village. Their footprints mixed together on the snow. Each step seemed to carry not only their own fatigue, but also the weariness of those who had walked before them. When he reached home, the sky had turned a dark gray, and fresh snowflakes had begun to fall from one corner of the heavens. Ivan closed the door behind him and leaned his back against it. He stood there for a while, listening to the crackle of the stove in the silence. When he went inside, the fire from the wood had faded somewhat. He quickly threw a few more dry branches in. The fire revived, and the flames began to dance behind the iron door. For supper he prepared another simple meal. Some bread, some soup. Perhaps this time he could add an extra piece of potato. He had worked harder today, grown more tired. But then he changed his mind. Perhaps he would be even more exhausted tomorrow, he thought. To save a little for the future meant to take a little away from today. As he ate his meal in silence, he watched the shadows in the room. The light of the stove drew trembling shapes on the walls, danced on the icon, appeared and disappeared along the ceiling beams. From outside came the distant bark of a dog. Then the wind grew a little stronger, and snowflakes began to strike the window. Listening to these sounds, Ivan felt his eyelids grow heavy for a moment. Weariness wandered not only through his muscles, but through his thoughts as well. Yet before falling asleep, as he always did, he thought of the past for a short while. His father, in this very house by this same stove, had once said to him, "We, my son, are the shadow of the land. If the land warms, we warm. If it grows cold, we freeze. But the shadow can never be the land itself." At the time, he had not fully understood what those words meant. Now every day of his life showed him a different face of that sentence. Even so, there was a small place inside him that stubbornly kept believing. Every winter ended, every snow eventually melted, every log burned, brought at least one more night of warmth. Perhaps the big picture of life did not change, but the small moments, the little patches of warmth, were still precious. He pulled the blanket over his shoulders and sat a bit closer to the stove. He watched the embers inside, shades of red mixed into black, with thin streaks of yellow appearing and fading. It was as if the flow of time was being rewritten inside that tiny iron box. He leaned his head against the wall, and his eyelids grew heavy. Outside, the wind went on moaning, the snowflakes fell silently, and the village was wrapped in an ever-thickening white. But inside the house, in this small world, there was only the sound of the fire and the breathing of a tired man. Just before he drifted off to sleep, a short sentence passed through Ivan's mind. Today is over too. Somehow tomorrow will pass as well. There were no great hopes in that sentence, nor great despair. Only acceptance, only the heavy yet calm resignation of a peasant. When his eyes closed completely, the winter night laid a thin blanket of peace over his weary body. Snow went on piling up on the roofs. The wind whispered its old songs in the far branches of the forest. And in a small village in Russia in the 1700s, One more day in the quiet but sincere story of a peasant's life came to an end.